are going to have this panel discussion in English. We can change channels. So go to the bottom left, you will find the globe icon and you can change channels. So if you have further questions, we will have time at the panel discussion. Stefan Bienenfeld will take over. He is the coordinator of the DAAD and he will take over.
Frau Gallus, I will now switch to English and I hope that everybody can hear me properly. We have a number of international participants on the panel, so we decided to do the entire discussion in English. I hope that's fine for everybody. In case you need translation, as Kati Gallus mentioned, the translation button is available on the left side of the application. This panel will focus on the question of promoting diversity and equal opportunities in international university cooperation. That is to say, in the projects that DAAD and other funding bodies finance with German universities and international partners. And there's a couple of general questions that we will address apart from the more specific questions to all the panelists. Those general questions are: how can research and education contribute to more social cohesion and more inclusion? How can research, higher education, and corporations be designed in a more inclusive way? So how can we take more note of different needs and inclusive mechanisms to not exclude people from the very beginning from participating in projects? And the third question is more directed to organizations such as DAAD, but also the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Which role can funding organizations and political entities play in these endeavors? So what would be needed from our side to support these mechanisms more? We have a panel with 4 distinguished panelists, and I will go through them by the order of the program. The first is Professor Pao-Yu, Professor for Sustainable Energy Transition Economics at the University of Flensburg in the very north of Germany, close to the Danish border. He is the head of a DAAD project of a global climate center, TRAJECTS, that deals with the transition from fossil energies. We will come more to that in a moment with Colombia and South Africa. Dr. José Carlos Orihuela, professor at the Catholic University of Peru, the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Perú, and a board member of the DAAD-funded project Trandes. That is a project funded by the BMZ in Germany, a graduate school that deals with social inequalities in Latin America and mechanisms of how to overcome them. The third panelist, Professor Gülay Çağlar, holds a professorship for political science at the Freie Universität of Berlin in Germany, with a focus on gender and diversity issues. And she has been heading a partnership in a higher education management program of DAAD called DIAS, called EQUIP, Equal Opportunities in Higher Education, with partners in Africa. And last but not least, Dr. Cornelius Hagenmeier. He's the director of the International Office of the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein in South Africa, and he will tell us about the experiences in South Africa. But before we go to South Africa and to Kenya and also to Peru. We will start with Professor Uy and his project with Colombia and also South Africa. And the questions that I would have for the beginning is, Professor Uy, tell us briefly what your project is about and in which way does it follow an inclusion-oriented approach? What do you try to do to take the local communities that are most heavily affected by your research area with you in the process?
Thank you very much for the possibility to speak here. Hello also to all people in Germany and abroad talking about this very important and timely topic. And I would like to share some experiences from our climate center. We are, as already mentioned, on 2 different continents, so there's many different backgrounds. And also the centers in Colombia and South Africa try to be basically a hub for the entire continents. Of course, they cannot basically deal with all the complexities of an entire continent, but they still try to do a lot of outreach activities, and we try to support also students coming from many different other countries in the global south, including a South-South exchange. So an additional attempt of us is basically to enable people from one country to go to another country in the global south to learn from one another. And there, even if you look at Colombia and South Africa, even though they might be more similar to one another than Germany and South Africa, still there's a lot of differences within these countries. And even within the countries, for example, in Colombia, we cooperate with a university in Bogota, in the capital, which is a very it's a great university, more like an elite Ivy League university. And then we have a regional university, basically situated more in the coal region of Colombia, where our focus is then, for example, also more to cooperate with the communities on the ground, to communicate with bachelor programs, because they don't have that many master programs, they don't have that many PhD programs, and we try to have a high diversity of actors within our scholarship holders, which could be master or PhD scholarship holders or scholarship holders for short internships. And there we look at diversity with respect to ethnic background, we look at gender aspects, we look at religious backgrounds. And I think it's very important because people coming from different backgrounds come with a different CV. And if you take the same standards to them, then some of these people will not meet the requirements. For example, speaking fluent English if they come from a community within Colombia, or they might not have a master's degree yet, but they still have a lot of experience on the ground having worked on this topic, climate change, how to phase out coal and how to do it in a sustainable manner, even in a better way. So therefore, I think it's important to acknowledge different ways of acquiring knowledge and not only evaluating this in how many master's degree, how many peer-reviewed papers do you have, but also looking at the knowledge on the ground. It's of course important to look at language aspects, to include people, and then also in the end, when we acquire knowledge within these regions, to bring this knowledge back to them and not only use the knowledge acquired by people on the ground to publish in journals in the global north, to acquire professorships in the global north, but also to basically translate them into publications that can be helpful on the ground. And this does not only mean translating them into Spanish, but sometimes also in a different kind of written style, or perform videos or other booklets which are easy to be understood for people that are not on a daily basis reading journal publications. So I think this is important in what we try to do with our topic, Just Transition, which is supposed to include a lot of different actors, because we also believe we will only enable a more sustainable life afterwards if we have included all the existing expertise within this region. So it's not only trying to enable them, but it's also just profiting also from the knowledge that they have on the ground.
Thank you very much for this insight into your project activities. You mentioned that you're trying to work with different formats and to also take note of knowledge that is there on the ground. But let's dive into this a little more in detail. When you send out a call for applications for scholarships for masters or PhDs in your project, what are the mechanisms that you use concretely in the selection process to make sure that there are equal opportunities for all applicants, regardless of their origin, of their background? How does this work concretely in practice? Could you explain this a little more in depth?
Yes, I would love to. First of all, we gave ourselves a target. So basically, for example, at least 30% of all our scholarships should go to people from underrepresented groups. This is our target. However, then how do you evaluate this? We basically look at all the applicants and we basically rate them on different categories. There's, of course, the question, how do they fit to our scope? What is academic excellence? And how far is the local partner that would receive this person to their institution be willing to accept that candidate? But then there's additional category, which is basically stating, is this person a category of member of underrepresented groups? And you would get specific additional points if you are a member of an underrepresented groups. And we discussed a lot within our community, basically how to evaluate this. And it's sometimes difficult to value from the outside and how far a person is underrepresented or not. So in most cases, we basically ask people for self-declaration, and they can basically state that they consider themselves to be underrepresented, and we provide them with different descriptions of what we would assume, what we would understand as being underrepresented. It could be gender, ethnicity, the region that you come from, etc., from a certain different background, sexual orientation, it could be whatever. And for example, in South Africa, as probably also Professor Hagenmeier is afterwards talking about, in South Africa, there's a lot of awareness with respect to the aspect of race already. So there is a lot of knowledge on this, but at the same time, there's always then the challenge of then putting too much pressure also on the criterion, etc. So therefore, we found it very helpful. From our first cohorts, we realized that we did exceed this 30% target, but we actually have more than 50% of the people qualifying to some of these underrepresented elements. And I think it is important that you basically take this into consideration, because the other opportunity that some people sometimes discuss to basically anonymize a CV and basically let's not look at gender, but just basically rate everyone the same, does not take into consideration that some people, due to discrimination beforehand, do not have a CV that looks that good on a first hand. However, if you take into consideration that it was much harder and much more difficult for them because they have two kids to take care for, etc., then having reached still that level of qualification is much better, and we really want to support these people. So I think this is helpful. However, what we also realized is it's not enough to only look at this application procedure, but you also need to take a bit closer care during the project, as there's a higher risk that these people might drop out of the system because they also need additional jobs, sometimes to pay for additional aspects. So therefore, it's not only sufficient to look at the entry, but also to accompany through this process, which, however, will benefit the entire element.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that gives a very concrete impression of what you're trying to do. And thank you also for noting that it's not only necessary to help people in gaining access to higher education, but to also then make sure that they actually follow through with a degree. I think a lot of the measures to fight discrimination and to promote inclusion are focusing on the question of access, which is, of course, the issue of pivotal importance. But once the people are in the system, as you mentioned, it is also quite important to have sufficient support mechanisms to get them through the system successfully, and not leave them alone, because they come with different, as you said, they come with different preconditions. That means they also have different needs for counseling. One last question before we move on. There is a long discussion and an ongoing discussion about the equality of partnerships between countries in the global north and in the global south, and there's always a feeling that of a comparatively large disparity in positions between universities in the industrialized world and in the developing or transition countries. How do you make sure in your cooperation with your partners in Colombia and South Africa that this is really an equal partnership, and that the German university is not dominating the project too much?
Mhm. I think this is a big challenge, especially if the money is literally coming from Germany. And basically, through this, in our scheme, the money is coming through the German universities. We are channeling it to these universities in the Global South. We try to give them as much autonomy as possible, but nevertheless, we are the ones, the bad guys, who have to look at the bureaucratic hurdles, what is allowed to be financed through which procedure. And therefore, as some papers, documents are more available in German, then it's sometimes us basically saying this is possible, this is not possible, and having to explain German bureaucracy to civil society actors in the Global South is not an easy thing to do. And this is, I think, therefore important to explain it appropriately and to also take their concerns very seriously, and then to try to find ways around them. In some cases, also with a good cooperation with the DAAD, we are very lucky to have been a bit more flexible on some elements. I think it helps to have a diverse team even in the Global North. The majority of my team members who are coordinating this actually are originally from Colombia in our case, who then have undergone through certain German additional education, doing a PhD here, doing a master's here, but they at least they know the language, they know the culture, and they can serve as a literally translator of different cultures. So therefore, I think this can be of help. And I think it is important to basically situate from the beginning onwards that we as universities in the global north and south are on the same level. And in our case, the advantage is that it's basically several partners in the global south and us in the global north. So it's basically, if you look at the number of participants within the discussions, we have more global south and global north people. So therefore, this creates less hierarchy, I would say, and I would hope for. And I think one risk that people in the Global South sometimes feel is that, especially if they come to conferences and venues in Germany, that they feel a bit like a diversity token sometimes. And there's this risk that people want to have a picture also with them. Let's put some people from South Africa there, someone from Colombia, and someone from India, and then let's make a nice, colorful picture. And let's look that there's at least some women on the picture. And then it feels like, well, you're not looking for excellence, for expertise, but you're just looking as a token. And this is, I think, important to really acknowledge that, even though we of course also like to advertise our great program, we are more interested in the knowledge that they have, and therefore take also the concerns very seriously. And I think we're relatively on a good way, but at the same time, it's always a continuous challenge, and we always have to be aware of this, that we give them as much autonomy as possible with the funding, as they know what they're doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will now move on to Professor Çağlar. Professor Kaldewey also mentioned in his talk that concepts of diversity and inclusion can differ depending on the specific national or regional context that they are situated in. And since you managed a program dealing with management issues on equal opportunities in higher education with African partners, the first question would be, how was this feeling for you when you started your cooperation with partners in Ghana? Did you feel that the concepts of diversity and inclusion were similar to the concepts that you have at the Free University of Berlin, or were there differences? And if so, how did you handle those issues? How did you come to some sort of consensus of what are the really relevant issues to tackle when it comes to equal opportunities?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, let me also thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'm really thrilled to be here. Let me very briefly say a couple of words on the project. The project is called EQUIP, and Equal Opportunities in Higher Education Partnership for Institutional Change with the University of Cape Coast in Ghana and Kenyatta University in Kenya. And we primarily focused at gender equality policies and the incorporation of an intersectional perspective into these policies. And I will come to the issue of categories in a minute, but the aim of our project was mainly to build structures and a system for the professionalization and the education of gender equality officers. You have to know that in our partner universities, there is no such a system, such as gender equality officers as in Germany. And I was asking myself, how do these universities tackle issues of gender inequality, and how do they advance gender equality policies if they do not have the funds and the resources to do so as we have? And we thought that a training program would help to advance gender equality policies. So that was the idea, and we had a 4-year plan. The first part was on, first of all, doing a SWOT analysis and identifying the challenges for implementing such a program and or the advancing factors. And secondly, we introduced our system that we have at Freie Universität Berlin and a training program, because we do have a training program for gender equality officers, which is called Futura. And we introduced our training program. The second step was then to translate this training program to the specific Ghanaian context. So our partners formulated themselves a training program together with our gender equality officers. We did a training of trainers, and afterwards the idea was to have a South-South dissemination project in terms of training other actors, gender equality actors within Africa, and the pilot was Kenyatta University. So the main aim was really to very briefly show and share what we are doing, but mainly developing the issues and the training program and the whole structure within the specific contexts. We developed the proposal altogether. And so our partners were included to the proposal writing from the beginning, which was extremely important, because it's not us who tell them what to do, and we also learned a lot from them, but I can come later on to that. So in our first workshops, to answer your question, now I'm coming to your question. In our first workshop in Ghana, at the University of Cape Coast, we had it was a very joyful discussion, I have to say. It was not tense. It was not, everyone was pretty relaxed, but we did have differences in terms of these different categories, starting from gender, actually, because when we introduced our system of gender equality officers and the whole legal system and our structures, there were a lot of questions around the issue of how we are including, or whether we are including men also as partners in the whole system. And secondly, we had discussions around the category of ethnicity, which was something that we opted not to further talk about, because there are differences. I mean, in Ghana, our partners told us that this is not an important issue, but from Kenya, we do know that there are some tensions around ethnic policies, and we rather thought that it is better to just focus at issues of gender equality. And another category that really played a huge role was age, actually, and age discrimination in the context of higher education.
Could you elaborate on that age discrimination, higher education, and how far did that play an important role?
So, well, one very important thing is that that female students, but also researchers, get out of the system as soon as they marry and get children, of course. And this is one of the biggest challenges, that a lot of students do not keep on studying their master's degrees program and their doctoral programs, etc. So this is, the whole structure is really very, very difficult for these students, and it's very difficult to keep women and advance women for higher positions, because they are getting out of the system afterwards. So what are the supportive structures that exist there, So that is one thing. And one issue that is really important is sometimes after the children have been raised, women come back to the university and want to advance their academic career, but it's not very easy to do so when they are 40 years old or so. So that was a huge issue that our partners discussed a lot, and they even started the sensitization with schools. They collaborated with local schools around the university to sensitize the pupil for these kinds of questions. What it means to really take over an academic career and so on. So that was a very important issue. So, but particularly in terms of when can women come back to university and advance their PhD career and generally their academic career. Another thing is in terms of leading positions, of course, being a vice president, for instance, being a pro-vice chancellor, etc. So there are many implicit biases against women who want to take over these kinds of positions. And we did a lot of training on these kinds of issues, and particularly, in terms of leadership. That was a huge topic.
One last question. You mentioned that you did a lot of trainings with the university community, both in Ghana and Kenya. Now, how did people react to these trainings, especially those that maybe did not have that much knowledge beforehand? Or did you encounter any obstacles or people who were heavily opposed to what you were trying to do? And if so, how did you deal with that?
Well, I mean, we did, as I said, first of all, a SWOT analysis where we already identified our potential supporters. So that was pretty important. And we identified 4 different groups. First, those supporters who are in power, who are in powerful positions, who are in leadership, and who are strategically important to include into the whole system. The second were people who were very supportive, but had no position in a power structure, and then those who are not against it, and those who are let's put it that way, a bit more critical. We call them latents, those who we need to kind of include and discursively engage in our policies. And so we did not have really huge obstacles. I mean, the biggest obstacle during the whole process was COVID. I mean, that was one of our biggest problems during that time, and we had to digitalize a lot. But we also had faced a lot of technical problems. But we were able to overcome all of this, and thanks to to the very creative solutions that we were able to advance. And But we identified those actors and actively included them into our training program, which is why we had a really broad supportive structure. And those who did not support that much were not able to openly be against it anymore. So that was extremely important. Including the leadership is key in hierarchical structures as higher education institutions.
Yes, thank you. Including the leadership and building alliances to to make things to look for the right support structures, I think is a very good strategy. We will now change the focus again in terms of continents and move back to Latin America. Dr. Orihuela, you work with partners in Berlin in a project called TRAJECTS that deals with social inequalities in Latin America. Maybe you can explain to us how is the situation regarding social inequalities in the Andean countries, and how does the project address this in both the research activities but also in the educational programs that you run with your German partners?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation again. I'm very happy to share this time with you. It's a very interesting conversation. Inequality is a big topic. It's a defining topic in Latin America. The structural conditions of the region make the region the most unequal in the world. And so the contemporary developments, political or economic, are shaped by this structural condition. Particularly in the Andes, no? In the Andean region, because of the indigenous heritage, the legacy of it, and the different ways indigeneity has been politicized, the historical processes of this. Earlier, there was a discussion about what diversity was and how the terms of race, for instance, have a particular connotation in North America vis-a-vis other regions. This is very relevant for discussing Latin America and the Andean region in particular, because what is race, what is ethnicity has different meanings. There was the project of the, okay, I could talk hours about this, but to the point, the project of states, of modern states, was about homogeneity, and so sort of this idea of we are all mixed people, we are all mestizos, so there is no, and sort of whiten ourselves in a particular understanding of social Darwinism that has been very strong, I will argue, in our elites, in our thinking. It's still very alive, as you could tell by some political developments over the last years. And well, so that's the context in which our program, our initiative exists. Peru being a country that has its particularities. Well, the program is focused on inequality. So the research, it's a graduate research, graduate program. So it funds masters and doctoral students from the region. In PUC, which is the most important, PUC is the most important private university in Peru. Another piece of context is that the public university system is not well funded in all the region, but particularly in Peru, I will argue, well, it's hard to exaggerate. I guess you are reading the news. It's in very bad shape, the public system, and because of that, PUC, I will say, has sometimes the role that the public university systems should be having, no, in terms of giving opportunity. The university has this tradition of scholarships and having a different. So it's the equivalent to Universidad de los Andes that earlier was mentioned in Bogota, but is not. I think it's not as expensive. We have different categories. So I myself, I'm a graduate of the Universidad Católica. So, and Lima is, inequalities also has a spatial dimension in our regions. No? So we have, in Latin America, we have mega cities. And particularly in Peru, Lima, which is in the coast, not in the Andes, that explains a big chunk of the problems. It has a third of the population, so 10 million people live in the megacity of Lima. And well, so many people come to Lima to study. And so our university is quite diverse in terms of the background. It's different, like the university I was part of in the 90s. Although it was diverse, it's not as diverse as it is these days. You could tell by the color of the skin of the people, which is so nice to be in a more diverse environment these days, and which reflects more but still it has its problems and so on. So okay, so it funds master and graduate and doctoral students to do research on inequality. We promote interdisciplinary research and focus on also on in terms of inequality and sustainability. And because of that, we have students that we try. We have the bias. I have told you the big story of Lima being what it is and book being what it is for good and for bad. So we try not to give all the scholarships to to concentrate those in book. No, the attempt is to have a diverse class of cohorts. But it's difficult because of the conditions of the educational system. And then in terms of when we have people coming from book, we look at to talk about diversity again, place of origin, no, because it's different coming from Lima and coming from the outside Lima, from the provinces, as we say, as we Limeños say. Well, I'm a second generation Limeño by myself. That's the big picture of the story with the Trandes initiative.
Thank you for those insights you already mentioned, and I think this is also something that we can also see on the news with what's happening in Peru at the moment with the political turmoil that's in the country. You mentioned that the questions of ethnicity, indigeneity, and also inequality in the more general terms is very heavily politicized. Does that impact on your research, on your work? Would you say it is actually dangerous to ask certain questions, or how do you deal with the fact that these issues are so heavily politicized in the Peruvian context?
Yes, it is. It's difficult to make some questions in some places, for sure. Not only geographical places, not but say in the social pyramid. And we are living very sad times, dangerous times, no? When you have part of society that doesn't recognize another part of society. So it's difficult. Even if for people that have followed the news, there is this use of the word terrorist. It has become part of public discourse. And so the label is used to name people who are opposing, who are making some political standpoint against the regime or against the state of affairs, and very easily the label terrorist is used for those. So if you live in a country where this is becoming the norm, where it's now current practice, having the country, the history that it has, because this comes from the fears of the coming back to the 80s, to the 80s and 90s, to the time of political violence, that we had a very awful time of violence with the Shining Path. And this fear of the Shining Path is used for as a political weapon. So then it means it's in this context, it's difficult to carry out research. No, if you want to ask what's going on in a particular location where you have extractive industries, and you will start to make questions, then you may be portray in one way or the other, depending on which part of the social system you belong. No? So sometimes it's even easier for foreigners to do research because of this, no? Because you are not as easily labeled to be in one. Because you are just trying to understand things, but then trying to understand things, doing research can become dangerous.
Thank you very much, I think, for these insights and also for sharing this. I think this is the question of not being able to ask certain questions, especially when it comes to extractive industries, is something that you share with the situation in Colombia and also partly in South Africa, which is also relying on extractive industries, at least as part of its economic model. And where we will move now to Cornelius Hagenmeier. I was a little bit afraid that you lost your electricity, but now your camera is back on, so you're still with us, which is good to see. As I mentioned, you're the director of the University of the Free State. You've also been carrying out research on equal opportunities and equal partnerships between universities in the North and the South. And the first question that also comes back a little bit to the presentation of Professor Kaldewey, who also mentioned these different discourses of internationalization versus diversity and equality. From your research and from the situation in South Africa in particular, how strongly are internationalization and issues of quality, equality, or inequality interconnected?
Very much. And quick correction, I'm the director of the international office, not of the university. So indeed, I have been carrying out research on equality. And what I found was that overall, we are not doing too badly. Whilst there are serious equality challenges, nevertheless, by and large, we can say that in many respects, equality is being achieved. However, we need to recall that equality is a concept which is little understood. One of the most surprising findings of my research to myself was that out of my respondents who were senior international officers, that is those responsible for internationalization and partnerships. And I had 89 responses, not a single one came back to me and was able to give me a formulation of what equality in higher education partnerships means to the person. To me, that means we really need to have a deeper discourse. We need to talk about equality. And what I'm proposing is that we actually should look at 4 dimensions which are buttressed and underpinned by a value foundation which all equal partnerships should have, which would include that they need to be based on mutuality, they need to be based on Ubuntu, African value relating to humanness. With regard to what would characterize an equal partnership, I'm proposing that we then should look at the redistributive dimension where we see that there is equally meaningful co-funding or contribution, not necessarily money, can be time, can be immaterial, but there must be a real commitment, and that the benefits are equally shared, but the benefits, again, can differ depending on the priorities of the partners. Then we need to look at the dimension of equal worth. I call it the recognition dimension. And here it is important that partners are actually affirming their value and that there is inclusive participation. Third, communication and shared decision-making are critical for equal partnerships. And last, and this leads us back to what we heard earlier, the beauty of diversity, that we affirm diversity of partners in collaborations.
Thank you. That sounds interesting as a model for analyzing the phenomenon. And I know because my colleagues briefed me on that you also worked in an Erasmus Mundus project called Ikudu that deals with internationalization at home through online collaboration and has a particular focus on Africanization and decolonization of knowledge through co-creation. Now this sounds interesting, but how does this work concretely? What if to get a more concrete understanding what you mean by Africanization and decolonization through co-creation? Could you maybe explain this a little bit more in depth?
Yeah, thanks very much. And maybe to start by briefly introducing the Ikudu project, which is a capacity building project funded under Erasmus+. Quite a few things in the project are different from what we normally associate with the Erasmus+ project. First of all, it's coordinated here from the Global South. Our university is the coordinating university. Second, we have a diversity of partners at both sides of the North-South divide. We bring together research universities, including universities with millennia of standing like University of Siena, with universities of applied sciences in Europe. On the other hand, here in South Africa, we have both historically disadvantaged and historically advantaged universities. Peculiar is also that we worked together on the project application, but the lead was here in the Global South. Our value foundation, we very consciously think about Ubuntu and equality when we structure our project is very important to us. And probably last to mention, introducing the project is that we have a principle. No matter which aspect of the project it is, we have co-leadership by a South African and a European partner. So as you already mentioned, we are focusing on developing a concept for curriculum internationalization, which integrates COIL virtual exchanges. So let's hark back to your question on decolonization and Africanization and how it is infused in the project. Maybe to say, like all or many African higher education systems, ours evolved out of colonial history. We had in 2015 almost a student uprising. It was called Fees Must Fall. And that actually alerted us to having to consider decolonization dimensions when we want to meaningfully internationalize the curriculum. The risk here at the time was that some would have seen almost like a competition between internationalizing and decolonizing. So what we tried to construe was that those are complementary processes, if rightly understood. So how does that work in practice? We work in two different working groups, one more practical, one more theoretical. In the practical aspect, we develop virtual exchanges, but in the theoretical aspect, we work with a cross-section of university stakeholders in order to develop a concept from which universities for their own strategies can intelligently borrow, which sets out how you can infuse pluriform perspectives in a curriculum and do so while connecting students through virtual means. And the last aspect is very important for our conversations about inclusion. We intentionally chose virtual mobility not physical mobility as that's what we would be advancing. Because being positioned here in the global south, we experience that at undergraduate level, it is probably 0.1% of students who can participate actively in outgoing mobility. It looks much better at the postgraduate level, but to particularly at the undergraduate level, be able to offer our students an international experience, we need to work on concepts which bring the international home, and that is where the virtual exchange plays a critical role. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing these very interesting insights also in the work in South Africa. Now I'm looking a little bit to participants here in the larger group. Are there questions that you would have to either one of the panelists from the side of the audience? I've looked at the chat, there's nothing in there so far, but maybe someone has a question now. If not, I will just continue, but I wanted to give you the opportunity at least to pose questions to our panelists. No, not so far. Well,
Mr. Bienenfeld, there's one hand signed by
okay.
Esteban Meja. So just to let you know if you haven't seen that.
Okay, I haven't seen that, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. I feel deeply connected with this special session because I am working also with a international cooperation of the DAAD graduate school like TRAJECTS. We work with Vietnam, so we are like sister schools. And we have been dealing with all the same problems you have. But I have a question probably to all the panelists regarding another type of exclusion or discrimination that was not touched so far, and this is towards people with disabilities. So we have had in our graduate school the case of a student who became had an accident, and then suddenly this person was we didn't know what to do with this situation, because so we realized there was not a structure in place to deal with students with disabilities. So I wonder if in your cooperations, as in the same as you have consider ethnicity, religion, gender, all these, have you so do you have in place strategies to deal with disability exclusion or discrimination, or well, you know what I mean?
Well, thank you for the question. Yesterday we had some experiences from individual students with disabilities, some visible and some non-visible ones, who reported their experiences. But yes, exactly. But exactly. Anyone from the panel here, is there any specific experience on disability issues? Not in Flanders, no. Well, what I can tell you, at least from our side, from the DAAD side, is that we offer also in the project funding. There is the possibility, like with the individual scholarships that we heard of yesterday, there is the possibility to apply for additional funding to cover extra costs that might be linked to the disability that is there. And these costs can also be included in the project's costs. So that is something that we changed a couple of years ago to make it more flexible, to cater more for the needs of students with disabilities. But yes, Mr. Oui, please, Pao-Yu.
Yes, we didn't look so much at people with disabilities. What we had was people within communities who would not be able to go to the city, basically. So therefore, we sometimes have like these mobile transition schools where we literally go to the villages within the communities, or we provide internet access to people who cannot come to us, and therefore we would pay for minutes for them to be able to log in, as otherwise they wouldn't have the financial means. They have the smartphone, but they don't have internet access to attend. So therefore, I think this can help for people that are not able to physically go to a meeting for whatever reason, if they have childcare or other aspects, but it's a bit different than physical disabilities. But then with respect to physical disabilities, of course, it depends on the universities and how far our rooms have access, and we can provide additional services for that, which is a bit sometimes beyond the scope of our projects. However, it is, of course, you're correct that it's sometimes good to take this under consideration. Like we had this in another project with project meetings, then with one person with a wheelchair, and then basically making sure that every room that we have meetings in is wheelchair accessible, and that someone else takes care that this is the place, and that it's not the person with the wheelchair who always has to ask, did you have in mind once again that I'm coming with a wheelchair, so that they don't have to take the extra burden. I think this is important.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this. Is there other questions from the audience? Marianne, I don't see the family name, sorry.
Yeah, Marian Gutierrez.
Okay, yes, please.
Yes, first, thank you so much. It was so interesting to hear you all. And it's just like a comment, and also like you say, Mr. Oi, I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, but about like that sometimes for scholarships or for applying for programs, like there's normally this requirement about language. Like, for example, you should provide a certificate. Normally, it's like the TOEFL certificate. So me, like, I can speak for the international community, and like I have speak with a lot of friends that want to apply to, for example, for scholarships, and to show that you have the certificate, it's kind of, for example, because normally they ask for TOEFL or DAAD certificate for some English level. So I think if instead of using these certificates, like you based like the level of maybe in the common European framework of reference of language, will be easier for students to apply to these programs and scholarships, because international students, like for example, the ones that came here to Germany, it's like they have a background that when they are here, they need to learn German. So they will focus on learning German. And maybe they have already learned before English, but it's not like now you will start doing like a preparation course for doing a TOEFL. So maybe that's a point that sometimes it's not like unfair, but having the knowledges of English or other languages and not be able to apply for scholarships or program because you need to show this kind of certificate. I think like maybe in the application process, you could consider like, I don't know, maybe show your courses that you have at the university at that language, or show your background, or another kind of exam, but not only this this certificate. That's my point of view. So I guess it's like the situation of a lot of students that are like foreigners in other countries.
Thank you. Pao-Yu, you want to react to that?
Yes, I can agree. I think there's two different elements. The first thing that I was talking more about before was that simply within some regions, people don't have the language qualification. They simply don't have them. And therefore, from our understanding, we still wanted to include some of these people because they had local knowledge and they had expertise, and it was more important for them to be experts than to speak English if they would anyhow more work on a case in Colombia. So therefore, we included them despite them not having the language, no matter whether it's certificate or not. The second thing that you were talking about is, I think, also true that some people have the language, but they just don't have the certificate, or the certificate would be really expensive, or it's outdated, etc. So it puts in an additional barrier, which might discriminate people who are not able to pay for this. And therefore, I think it's important to be flexible. I'm also head of a study program here in Germany. And we, for example, also state that English is mandatory to attend the course. And we really need people to have a sufficient level of English. Otherwise, they cannot follow the course. So they really need to have this. But we are a bit more flexible and don't say just this test or this test, but we say they should somehow now state how they have this. And if we see their entire master program was in English before or something, if they were abroad, then we say, okay, this is sufficient. And with some individuals, we might do a short video call to basically just verify, because honestly, after like 3, 4, 5 sentences, you get a better understanding how good the quality is. And this is sometimes more helpful then also. But it takes an additional effort, but I think it's sometimes worthwhile.
Thank you. Esteban, is this a new hand or the old one still?
No, it's actually a new hand. So I wanted to react on this topic that Marianne brought here. To tell you what we do. So in our school, we work with the Vietnamese students, and we decided to bypass or to ignore completely this test, because the fact that a student has an IELTS or TOEFL test of very high score, it doesn't mean that this person is able to communicate in English. That doesn't mean anything. And the other way around, you can have a student who doesn't have money, access, or the physical way to go to some place and make this test. And this person can communicate perfectly. So what we do is we simply interview every single applicant. We talk about life and weather and everything to see if this person can communicate. And if we can communicate with them, means that they can communicate with our colleagues or the other students in the university. So that is our assessment. And once they are here, we give them the chance to have material in their native language, so in Vietnamese, yeah. So security issues or like instructions about health, the health system and bureaucracy in Germany, like a handbook in Vietnamese, so they don't miss anything just because of this language barrier. It's extra work for us, but it works.
Thank you very much for sharing those experiences, especially when it comes to language issues. Now, if Kati Gallus still allows me one last question to the panelists, I would have a question, because I mentioned the panel was also to deal with the question of funding bodies and how we work as organizations. Let's consider a fairy tale scenario. I'm the good wizard, and I'm offering each of you one wish, only one particular wish. What would need to be improved in the funding programs that DAAD offers? What would be your concrete wish to DAAD? What could or should we do differently? Difficult question. Yes, please, Cornelius, go ahead.
Maybe, well, first of all, to say a lot of things are done very well, but to encourage more project leadership from the Global South, I think would be excellent. That would be my first wish.
Okay, encourage project leadership from the South. Other wishes to DAAD as a funding organization?
Maybe from mine, to be honest, I'm not sure exactly how the status quo is, but for us, giving ourselves a quota that we wanted to achieve helped us to pressure us, which in the end we over exceeded by far. But we had this discussion before, and I had proposed within our proposal writing 50%, and people were very skeptic. So then we only had put 30% into our proposal. And now in the end, during the process, we have acquired more than 50%. So therefore, but it really helps having these quotas are helpful. People don't like them, but they work.
Okay, quotas for scholarships, for distribution, for inclusion. Yes. Professor Schaller, Jose Carlos, any other wishes?
Well, really reflecting again the rules for how to use the funds, and because they sometimes do not match the reality on the ground, and that is something, I don't know how realistic this is, because I do understand that we do have to comply to rules that are not set by the DAAD themselves, but this would be something that we really need to reflect upon and critically discuss, because this is something that sometimes disturbs the collaboration between the Global South and German partners, indeed, and maybe also developing material that in English that really explains where these rules come from and why these rules are important. That would be really important, because then we do not have to translate, because it's always we always have to come over with the bad news on how to use the funds, and this really is a problem. This really, because there is the global north-south divide, and if the DAAD would do this themselves, that would be great, you know. And yeah, so
okay. I think we've we have been starting to translate more and more things into English, but I admit that there's still room for improvement, especially on the rules and all this very complicated German bureaucracy. But to be honest and to be frank with you, it's also sometimes not so easy for us to translate this, because for some of these very technical legal German terms, there isn't even a proper English translation. So you have to work around it and explain it in many words, yeah, because this is so specific to our national legislation when it comes to public funds that can sometimes be very complicated. Cornelius, you had another point.
The last wish on the list, and that is that the DAAD should focus more and strengthen the move towards digitalization and build more programs which go beyond mobility, which include internationalization at home dimensions, which widen the circle of participants beyond those who are involved in physical mobility.
Well, I can already give you good news, even though not with a concrete time frame. We are working on this very much to include more digital elements into all our funding programs, and to also make regulations for this available on how this can be done. Jose Carlos, is there any wish from your side to DAAD?
I agree with all that has been said. No, digitalization, very important. The issue of rules, explaining them or softening them. And also this idea of quotas and making more transparent the whole issue of how these programs include people. No, so I really like these points.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have reached a number of issues to work on for the future. We've learned from a lot of very different experiences and very different contexts. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences. For me, this was a very interesting hour. I hope it was also for the rest of the audience. And I now give back to Kati Gallus for the moderation of the remainder of the morning. Thank you.